Some of the memories that Daly would have told us, one of the ones I thought was quite interesting was that because his right arm was amputated in the cotton mill, he was able to tie his tie and tie his shoelaces.
He must have used his teeth, I think. He was born in 1846 in Strait, County Mayo, and he was only 4 years old when the whole family were evicted from their cottage, and he was there while it was set on fire and terrible scenes.
Level to the ground, really.
Yeah.
And they couldn't pay the rent because the failure of the potato famine, even though apparently at the time of the famine, food was being exported from Ireland.
They were sent to the workhouse. They were told that all children over 3 would be separated from their mother. Well, when Mrs. Davitt heard that, she took them out immediately. They got help from a priest, I think it was, and they ended up anyway going to Haslington in north of Manchester. There were a lot of Irish people settled there already because of the cotton mills, and there was employment there and everything.
And he was a child worker at the age of 10, you know, in one of the mills.
And then at 11 years of age, he had the industrial accident and his arm had to be amputated. And he was chloroformed and everything, held down while that was being done. The only good thing that came out of that was that he was taken on by this Wesleyan school. Pastor, yeah, and they educated him. That was a wonderful break for him.
He felt that all children should be educated together and that religion should be looked after by the different churches. And that would have brought him, of course, into conflict with particularly the Catholic Church. I think it was in 1865 he joined the Fenians. He became an organising secretary. He
rose in the ranks immediately. He joined the Fenians, you know, and they were smuggling arms, and that's when they were caught and he was arrested. He was given 15 years.
Hard labour.
Hard labour, yeah. Now he did get a ticket of leave after 7 years.
But 5 of those first years he was in a cell on his own in solitary confinement, in a tiny cell. There were no concessions because he had only one arm, you know.
When he was released after the 7 years, he came over with a few other prisoners back to Dublin and then made his way to Connaught. Then he saw the tenant farmers were no better off than when he was evicted.
In 1877 then he was released on a ticket of leave, and he toured America to get support for the Irish.
One of the original founders of the original Land League here in Mayo was a guy called James Daly, and he was a great-granduncle of mine. Daly was editor of a local newspaper here in Mayo called the Connaught Telegraph, and he had been using the newspaper to highlight tenant grievances in County Mayo during the 1870s. He was approached by a number of residents of an estate in Irishtown in County Mayo, and they wanted him to highlight the grievances that they were having with their landlord. He was a bit concerned to do that because of libel, but what he suggested was if they held a meeting, he would report on the meeting. So they took up that suggestion. He chaired the meeting, and this became quite a famous meeting in Irishtown because thousands of people turned up at the meeting, and it was the beginning of the Land League agitation, because at that meeting the sheer mobilisation of local people suddenly gave confidence to, if you like, grassroots activists that they could effect a change, and the landlord, who happened to be a Catholic priest, relented, and the rent increases that he had intended he withdrew. So suddenly you had this model of popular agitation. So Daly was instrumental in that. He wrote about it, and then they replicated this particular model in subsequent meetings. Davitt got involved just a little bit after this. In fact, James Daly invited Michael Davitt to come to Mayo. So Davitt's genius, which makes him the really important figure here, is because he saw the national potential of this, of the land agitation and the mobilisation that he was looking at, that it was already underway in Mayo. The Mayo Land League had already been founded in Castlebar. He saw that this was a big thing, that this could be scaled up nationally. And he also saw, of course, that it could bring together the constitutional political people and the physical force people in the famous New Departure. So Davitt had a much more sophisticated political horizon. The people in Mayo were just focused on simple grievances of the tenant farmers. Davitt saw this as a much bigger thing. Also, Davitt was an internationalist. He had a global perspective, who was very shaped by left-wing thinking. He was very influenced by socialism. He was reading at a much more sophisticated level in terms of class politics in the UK, because he was looking at class exploitation. 19th century industrial revolution. He was a victim of it himself as a man who had become disabled in a factory accident. He knew exactly what that was about. So he read what was happening in Mayo through those lenses, and that's also a very unique perspective, because it meant he was a fresh thinker. He had an insider view, but he had also an outsider view. He convinced Parnell and the Republicans to combine behind the Land League and to use the Land League as a mechanism to advance both causes,
he was able to persuade Charles Stewart Parnell to become president of the Land League. He was cute enough to realise that Parnell was a good parliamentarian, so, the two could work together.
What was happening in the Land League was a population of people who, again, we have to remember, was only 30 years out of the Great Famine, where in Mayo in particular, the death toll was horrendous. I mean, Daly himself, in testimony to the Bessborough Commission a bit later, suggested anything up to 100,000 people had died in Mayo during the famine period. This was a very traumatised population, and here they were 30 years later taking a stand together in solidarity against very powerful figures, the landlord class. And this tactic of boycott or moral force is really the prototype for what later came to be called passive resistance or non-violent direct action, which of course in the 20th century became used very effectively by Gandhi in India and by Martin Luther King in the United States. But its historical origins in many ways go back to what was going on here in Mayo in the 1870s.
He was a leading advocate, I think, of moral force and passive resistance, and his no rent campaign, for example, against Captain Boycott, it was so successful that Boycott had to bring soldiers in from Scotland to work his estates. Hence the word boycott came into the English language.
We're in the county that was the site in 1880 of an attempted eviction of tenants from the estate of Lord Erne, and the landlord's agent's name was Captain Charles Boycott.
We're at the Michael Davitt Museum, but we're here at Michael Davitt's gravesite, the man who coined the phrase boycott along with the Land League. I just felt it was really important to come here today after being involved in the boycott with the other people in Dublin. We boycotted South African goods in 1984. There was 11 people who went on strike in Dunstores. People told us we wouldn't make a difference because we were too small and you'd need a lot more people. We were only a handful of girls. There was one lad. Well, a few people can make a difference. We managed to get the Irish government to change the legislation in the country, and we got them to boycott all agricultural goods coming from South Africa.
Carla King compared him to Nelson Mandela, his conversion to passive resistance. For instance, in the second part of his life, he became a journalist, and that's when he reported on the pogrom of the Jews in Russia, the Boer War, and the state of the Aborigines in Australia. The Land League paved the way for Irish political independence, because unless we got the land for the people of Ireland, you couldn't have got independence. Before Davitt was imprisoned again, this time in Portland prison, he persuaded Anna Parnell's sister, to found the Ladies' Land League. Parnell was completely against that, and so were most other, because they felt, that wasn't a thing for women to do.
Women using their brains?
Yeah, that was very successful, and she set all kinds of branches up in Ireland, while he was in
and
prison.
in the States.
I was interested in him as my grandfather, and from that point of view I tried to find out more about him. I eventually was able to consult his diaries and some of his letters and notebooks and things like that, all of which built up the picture of my unknown grandfather. And I was intrigued by the portrait by William Orpin. It was exactly the sort of a man I would love to have met. I think it's a marvellous picture.
Gerhard was of the British Labour Party, and he wrote about Michael Davitt, the people of Ireland owe more to him than to any of the rebel chiefs of their race. They found it very difficult to pigeonhole him, and even now it would be difficult. He was true to his convictions, and he wasn't going to be overruled by church or any power. I think that's why they found it so difficult to pigeonhole him. He'd be horrified at the homelessness, and he'd want to explore the causes, and that's
try
why.
and rectify it.
Yes.
My father used to receive postcards daily from when Michael Davitt was on his travels. At the time, I think he went off every country in Europe.
He was an avid gardener and used to buy packets of seeds in Mackenzie's there in Pearse Street. And he'd comment about the way his flowers were up this particular year. They were up early. As he said in one of his diary entries, the ideal evening was sitting at home with his wife playing the piano and singing.
To my friends I leave kind thoughts, to my enemies forgiveness, and to Ireland my undying prayer for absolute freedom and independence.